If you're leading an enterprise team right now, you're likely feeling a very specific kind of friction. The roadmap is packed, the budget is tight, and no matter how much talent you hire, the queue never seems to get shorter. The workload never seems to go away, right? Uh, I'm Mathieu, and for the past 27 plus years, my firm, Allari, has been running up IT operations inside Fortune 500 companies. Um, about 15 years ago, we decided to track and measure every task that we actually have ever executed. And we basically were able to stop guessing about the friction that I'm speaking about and start measuring it. So tracking your own delivery execution in strict 15-minute increments is not easy. It was a major culture change, but we felt like it was the right thing to do. And we've been doing that for 15 years. And with the help of AI, we've been able to do a lot of analysis of that information. And here's what I'm going to show you today, what the data is showing us. Okay. And it will likely validate exactly what you are feeling. Because what we found is even well-funded IT teams are losing between 35 and 45% of their bandwidth to unplanned reactive work. Yeah, 35 to 45% of the human capacity of the core team is being lost to unplanned reactive work. Okay, and when this happens, our instinct is to ask the CFO for more headcount, right? But you and I both know that you cannot staff your way out of this kind of a structural problem. The reactive aspect, the queue itself, simply eats up the new hire's time, which is exactly why so many of these massive enterprise IT projects continue to stall or fail. You've heard the stats, and the failure rates are very high, and it's very scary, no doubt about it. Along the way, we discovered that the IT Process Institute has shown that the only way out of the situation I described, where you're losing 35 to 45% of your core team's capacity, is to have a relentless focus on root cause elimination. And in their study, they were able to figure out that the number one attribute of the top high performing IT organizations was a culture of causality. And these are the teams that just keep digging and digging and digging to see what's causing a problem. And then when they put a fix in, the fix is in there for good, right? And the organizations that we see that are actually achieving this, and we do have customers that are high performing IT organizations, and that is they're spending less than 5% of their entire core team's time on reactive work. Okay, so these kinds of organizations are out there, and you very well may be leading one of them. It's amazing if you are. They're very, very powerful, and they're fun to be a part of. But what we found with these types of organizations is that they actually separate the run and the build teams, right? So you sort of have like this isolation of the reactive noise from the people responsible for responding to change or implementing innovation. And this allows those people not to be pulled back into the day-to-day support, right? It allows them to solve problems instead of being part of the firefighting. I hope that makes sense. So let me continue on. That's the first slide. I said a lot. There's a lot to this, but I think the next 10 or so minutes will be worth your time if you're in the, your focus is the same areas that our focus are, which is to take an IT operations organization and transition it to a high performing um, machine, right? So when we look at, I'm going to look at this slide right now. When we look at the data across our own execution environments, and when we compare it to the IT Process Institute's research, which was across 850 organizations, it's very, very clear, and frankly, it's alarming um, to see the baseline that emerges. So in the average enterprise environment, which is about 85% of all enterprise IT organizations, this level of maturity within these groups, they're losing 35 to 45% of their team's capacity to this unplanned reactive work. And that tax is collected before a single strategic initiative even begins. So imagine that, right? That's pretty serious. And I can say through our experience that this number you see on this slide, has remained stubbornly consistent over the last 15 years. And it doesn't matter what industry we're speaking about. We have experience in a dozen plus industries, and it's irrelevant. And it doesn't matter how large the enterprise team is, or whether you're running SAP, Oracle, whatever, JD Edwards. The physics of the problem itself is the same. Okay, so keep that in mind. But what does this mean in practical terms? So if you are a 20-person core team, right, which is it's a good size, it means that roughly 8 of those engineers are completely absorbed by daily noise. So basically their capacity is drained by these escalations and workarounds. It could be, having to manage a vendor, or the quick favors that the users will go straight to the BA's desk and ask for assistance. It's a lot of work that doesn't make it into the form of a ticket, right? And all of this time that's spent isn't helping you to move your roadmap forward. This is just to keep the lights on, to keep the users happy, or to band-aid issues that are needing attention. But this particular gap has rarely been measured, right? Very few IT leaders have an understanding of this data, right? So it's hard to capture it and present it to a CFO if that's who you need to justify more money to. It's really, really difficult to quantify this. And without that hard number, every downstream conversation you have about budgets, project timelines, headcount is sort of based on this gray area of assumption. And that's where I find a lot of IT leaders get caught up. So when we look at our data over the last 15 years, we are able to see where this reactive load actually lives. And it's rarely where the organizations expect. right? It's not a major outage. It's not time lost in the war room. It's not on the bridge calls. I mean, those events happen, but they're episodic, right? What we've been able to determine is this capacity tax lives in the daily accumulation of low visibility work. Okay, it's those kinds of things where you have a user saying, this transaction's updating the wrong cost center. Can you run a SQL to fix that, or help me to figure that out? Can you check this before finance sees it? So you got to run a manual workaround. Sometimes on month end, there's some manual tasks that need to be done because the actual, problem was not fixed the right way. So it is executed to get through the month end, but then it's never addressed after the month end is over because something more important comes up and takes the team away in a different direction, right? But these kinds of things, and some of them could turn into 2 hours of work. You'll never see these on your dashboard, right? So that's kind of where this leak of human capacity can be found. I call it toil. It's TOIL, right? It's manual work, repetitive. It doesn't really drive long-term value. It rarely gets ticketed. You won't see it in your ITSM metrics. I don't know if I have it on the slide. Yeah, on the bottom there. And when you look at your service desk software, whatever that is, you'll see that your SLAs are getting met and your tickets are getting closed. But those metrics are only really measuring the output of the queue. They're not, I should say they're completely blind to the strategic bandwidth that this particular work is consuming. There's no relationship between, oh, our core team is spending 40% on reactive work, therefore every month that 5-year roadmap is getting delayed by 3 weeks. There's no metric that tracks any of that. And it's sort of a silent killer, right? And that's where, I don't remember what I called this, the title of the first slide, but it's probably the biggest theft within enterprise IT organization that I would say is prevalent in over 80% of these organizations. And it's a massive amount of money that's being lost every year collectively. So let's keep going here. Now, this here is where the data reveals the structural problem, right? In the area I showed you where the leakage is actually happening, this reactive queue is actually generating its own demand. Okay, so when most teams are operating at this 40% reactive load, the core team doesn't have the bandwidth for like a permanent root cause elimination. I see this in third-party integrations. They're very fragile. They break down a lot. They get patched, but they don't get fixed long-term, right? Instead, this core team, because of the stress and the workload that's on them, they really get forced to apply workarounds. And like I said, the workarounds may close the tickets, but they're not fixing it long term, right? And that's not true root cause analysis, right? That's just very, very different. But in a lot of the environments that we worked in the beginning of these relationships, these workarounds create configuration drift. You catch my drift. Now, this is like a very, very dangerous area, which cost the core teams a lot of time. These configuration drifts are basically what some people call fragile artifacts. But it's essentially undocumented fragility that's embedded directly into the system. And it happens over time, and it's definitely the cause of uh, unauthorized changes. But the next time that system fails after this change has been put in, the actual failure is more complex, right? And it requires more time of that core team member than it did the first time, if they're even available, right? It takes a lot more time to resolve, and because the team is now they're even more constrained by the outage or by the particular issue, it generates another workaround. So you see where this is going, right? There's this compounding effect of technical debt. Um, it it does not just slow down the systems, right? It sort of morphs into this experience debt, right? It becomes like a normalized state of friction that drains a lot of people's time and energy, and it has an impact across the entire organization, right? So these are like the reasons that workflows get broken, and why it's very difficult to build new capabilities, because this problem is just, it's compounding over time, and it's killing the environment, and it's very, very hard to get out from underneath it. So what we find is team members get burnt out, and they don't know how to get out of this, and it's often easier to find another place to work. So you will see turnover, right? So let's go to the next slide. Now, this here is um, sort of where we find another Band-Aid approach to the problem. So when an IT leader sees that this queue of undocumented work is growing, the standard response in the industry is to hire more headcount, right? I don't know if I put the math on. Oh yeah, I did. Okay, so let's look at this, right? Now, let's say that you decide to add 2 people, okay? In some states like Colorado and California, that could be upwards of $300,000 a year that you're adding to your payroll costs, right? But bringing those people in doesn't change the reactive ratio. It will stay at this 40% level. The new hires they're just absorbed into the noise, okay? And they'll come in with fresh eyes and this and that, they basically get sucked into the same operating model because it's broken. And when the operating model itself forces these people to go into this reactive mode, we have this thing that I'm sure you've heard of called context switching. And that's when a person, I'm just going to state it because, for the sake of this presentation or this briefing, it's when this person goes from fighting fires to implementing a change, or working on a migration to your latest and greatest ERP system that is going to take you away from all this chaos that the current core team is experiencing, which it really doesn't, right? Because the operating model is broken with this system. When you get the new system, it's also going to be broken. I've seen this many times, and I'm sure if you're an experienced IT leader like me, you've seen it as well. But this context switching is quite interesting, because even before you spend any time on a particular issue that's popped up, the studies have shown that context switching alone has cost that resource 23 minutes just for them to be able to go back into what they were focusing. And I don't have it on here, but we've seen that has happened quite a bit throughout each day of the week, up to 8 times a day. And when you're looking at it 8 times a day times the 23 minutes, you're talking about 3 hours a day of lost to just context switching, never mind the actual work itself. And when they do this context switching over a long period of time, the result, unfortunately, is severe burnout. And you could go back into other studies and other research articles about this, and this burnout isn't a failure of their resilience or their commitment to the job. It's actually a failure of the organization's design, the operating model itself. And when this tribal knowledge walks out the door, the organization in itself is going to spend 6 figures just replacing that senior talent. And once they get this new hire, they're just going to drop them back into the same broken physics. This capacity tax, this is what we call the capacity tax. This is something that's not quantified in organizations, and it is cancer. It's just horrible. It's just a horrible impact that it has on these organizations, right? So let's keep going. So when you add, in this particular slide, states on migration, but it could be any sort of major project, right? It could be AI, whatever it is. But when you add this sort of initiative to this team that's already losing 40% of their capacity to this broken model, the deficit becomes very acute, okay? So you have the same core team, the people who are carrying the tribal knowledge, who know every integration point, know every escalation. This is where you take all of the big problems to. Now they're suddenly expected to lead these vendor evaluations, process mappings. They're going to lead the data migrations. And all the while, this operational queue is not pausing. It's still there, right? And what we see I hate to talk like that, but basically these 2 work streams that really require the full attention is now shared by the same people. And neither of these initiatives or responsibilities gets it. So they both fall behind, right? You've seen an organization that's purchased a new software, bought all the bells and whistles, but when it's actually finally implemented, you're really only implementing 80% of the features and functions because that core team member that was leading it is constantly being pulled into production issues. So they can't give their entire focus. And then the vendor looks like they didn't perform as well as they could have, or as well as the contract says that they should have. But in fact, the collaboration itself was handicapped because the lead from the core team was never fully vested. And it wasn't that particular person's problem. It's just that their operating model wasn't set up correctly for them to be able to focus on the new project. So ultimately, the organization themselves lose out, and then the vendor gets a bad rep, right? How many times have you seen this happen? And I'm not saying the vendor's not at fault, because there are sort of things that the vendor should be sensitive to. Maybe the vendor should ask, what is the customer's change success rate? Is it above 98%? And what is the core IT team's throughput of effective change? Can they handle this project? Because if you're not measuring either of those, then you have to understand as a vendor that there's high risk to doing any major transformation, right? So there's sort of an ethics question there from my opinion, as to whether or not the new latest and greatest should even be sold to the enterprise organization. But that is the mission of these product vendors. They want to sell innovation, so they keep feeding the beast, right? All right, sorry for that tangent, but let's keep moving on. So when we measure this pattern that I'm speaking of over the dozens of environments that we support, the trajectory of this is very, very predictable. Yeah. So you can see here by day 30, you'll see that the ticket aging climbs. Now, most organizations already have high metrics in this particular area. But if you are starting from ground zero and you take this broken operating model, you'll see that by day 30, the tickets will start to climb. And by day 60, you'll see that the resolution of these tickets actually has doubled. And by day 90, you're in trouble, right? A red flag is going off, and you basically have 2 failing work streams instead of 1 succeeding. And eventually, the post-mortem of all of this will almost always blame execution or the implementation vendor. It's really rarely an execution problem, right? So let's look back at the slide here. When you look at like the forensic audits of these massive enterprise migration failures, I can't tell you how well documented it is, right? If you look at, for example, National Grid, Zimmer Biomet, it's all over the news, and you'll see that hundreds of millions of dollars in damages have resulted from these 2 failed projects. And they revealed the same exact root cause, right? It's a failure to implement this structural bifurcation. These 2 organizations try to run their legacy system and try to build the new one using the exact same pool of resources. It doesn't work, right? So if you look at the percentage of failures of implementations, it's extremely high. And you can see that it is the result of having these remarkable, brilliant, dedicated IT leaders being pulled in 2 different directions. It's just not feasible. It's set up to fail right away, right? And it's easy to be the Monday morning quarterback, but if you want to survive any major transformation or big project in an enterprise IT organization, you know this as well as I do, that the organization must have this operational airlock, right? It requires this dedicated, structurally isolated layer whose sole purpose is to absorb the reactive friction so that these strategic core team members can execute the roadmap without being interrupted. And that's exactly what needs to happen. But unfortunately, in this 80% plus of enterprise IT organizations, which the big project failure rate is up there at 80%, right? Depending who you ask, you'll see that it's just incredibly correlated, right? Let's keep going. I think I'm taking up too much time here, but let's keep going. So right now, we see that the industry is flooded with all these AI promises, right? Automate this reactive queue right away. But when you look at DevOps research, it confirms that. And how many posts have you seen on LinkedIn that say 92% of AI projects are failing because of bad data? Well, it goes deeper than that, right? AI doesn't fix a broken operating model. It's just going to amplify what's already there. So it doesn't matter if you're on SAP ECC going to SAP S4 HANA, if you're on JDO, it's migrating to NetSuite. It doesn't matter what the project actually is. Right? We have customers that are consolidating multiple ERP systems to one, or it could be implementing one of these fancy AI tools. It's irrelevant. If you have your MVPs, trying to keep your production system running, and then trying to implement these big projects, it's not going to work, right? So the disconnect that we're seeing, which I think is on this particular slide here, is, where is it? Basically, the AI is sort of making guesses on patterns, but the operation side itself has to be deterministic, right? An organization cannot point a probabilistic AI agent at 20 years of undocumented technical debt and workarounds and expect it to magically heal the infrastructure, right? So to make AI work safely and actually drive value, an organization, where am I at on this slide? An organization, they have to build the deterministic core of documented runbooks and enforce the governance, right? I don't want to go too deeply into this because I don't know too much about implementing AI in the enterprise IT operations environments. I haven't seen it done successfully yet at scale, but I do know from our perspective that we are using AI, but we're verifying it from a human perspective, and it has saved our customers a lot of money and delivered results much quicker. Okay, but I haven't seen it deflate a queue yet automatically, right? And I don't think that the operational recovery of this 35 to 45% capacity tax comes from hallucinated automation. I think it comes from expert managed systems at scale, and that still involves very much a human being. We're a system driven by human beings, right? Okay, so I would like to share with you a different way to approach this structural challenge that we're talking about. This is a customer of ours we've had for over 10 years. High performing IT organization, almost a 99% change success rate. Throughput of effective change is through the roof. This is the true definition of a high performing enterprise IT organization. One of the best places to work in the United States. It's a global organization, a very powerful company. And they have about 3,500 users, over 25 countries. So this particular company faced the exact collision point that we just talked about. They were running GDO as Enterprise One. They were executing a massive SAP migration. They needed to ensure that the GDO system was up and running globally. And they did this flawlessly. It was unbelievable. But they had the same finite team and the same exact capacity constraints. However, in this particular situation, before day one, okay, before they even started the first sprint, leadership made a single definitive decision. They decided that the people that were running the current system would not be the same people planning the next one. They enforced structural bifurcation. That's right. They brought us in. We set up an embedded operations team. We took full custody of the legacy environment, third-party software, everything, all the users from here to Japan. And we acted as the operational airlock. Now, it took time to get to this point, but it was well planned in advance. We knew what the runway was. We knew the schedule, we knew what needed to be done, and we knew when it needed to be done by, and we did it. right? And this isn't about patting myself on the back or my team on the back. I'm just saying that it's very possible. And when it is included up front, it will significantly reduce that stat that says 80 something percent of implementations fail. Well, they fail. You look at all of the posts on LinkedIn, they fail because this wasn't done and that wasn't done. But it really comes down to the resource capacity, the capacity tax. So when you set things up separately and you say, okay, this team is just going to focus on this now, and this team's going to focus on that, you are reducing that failure percentage significantly. Now, the actual forensic data from this particular engagement that we had is striking. Over the course of the 5-year migration, you know, the actual volume of service interactions doesn't matter, but it was very, very high. This is a very needy user base and in many, many different languages. But the point is that there were no escalations to the strategic build team. So once we actually made the cutover, when that finally did happen, we were able to keep the JD Edwards Enterprise One system up 100% of the time, do all of the patching that's done on a quarterly basis. In fact, we led the planned outages, doing all of the package deploys, the tools release upgrades, all of these things we were able to do without involving the previous regime. They stayed over there on the SAP side. They got their SAP training. They worked with the IBM implementation team. They did what they needed to do so that they could get up to speed quickly and be the future of the organization. They were able to look at workflows objectively and find ways to fix them without being pulled into, these production issues. Now, they were able to execute their roadmap, and there were no distractions from the business itself. Very, very special. Very, very special. This is how high-performing IT organizations work. Now, they face the same challenge that Zimmer Biomet faced and that National Grid faced. But because they deployed a different operating model, they achieved a vastly different outcome. Vastly different. And they're not the only ones in the United States that are doing this, right? But you just hear about the war stories. And I say United States, this is global, right? Because National Grid is not in the United States. But I don't want to take too much more of your time, but just to close this particular briefing, there's 3 questions. I've got them on the slide here. And I think from my experience, every IT leader has to ask these questions, right? They're not rhetorical, they're diagnostic. So the first question I have here is, what is your organization's measured reactive percentage right now? Now, don't give me a gut feel. Try and put a hard number on this. If you had to go to the CFO and you had to defend this number, what would that be? And if that number doesn't exist yet, I think that gap is worth closing, because every downstream conversation about project timelines, budgets, headcounts is shaped entirely by it. Yeah, think about that. I mean, this is just my experience. I'm not trying to tell you what to do. You obviously are an IT leader and probably have more experience than I do. I'm just sharing with you what we've seen, right? So the other question I find to be of value is, if your 2 most experienced core team members gave notice tomorrow, what actually walks out the door with them? If that particular answer is uncomfortable, it points to a tribal knowledge dependency that documentation alone will not solve, especially after they leave. Now, I've actually have been polling my peers to ask them. We've seen a number of peers needing to find new jobs due to reorg. They reorged, changed things up a bit. And I asked them, what was the process when they left? Because they had a lot of tribal knowledge. and they've given me their perspectives on it and how doing what they could do to leave the organization in the best shape possible. So the third question, we're almost done here. Third question here is, could a strategic build teamwork for, how can I say this? I might as well just read it. Could your build team work 60 days without interruption? You think that they could? And could they do it with the run queue moving at its current volume? If the honest answer to this is no, then the constraint is not planning, right? The constraint is a structural capacity. So I think that's enough time I've taken up. We've published this full data set, the methodology, the benchmarks, the architectural framework that we use. It's about 40 pages or so, and you can find it on this link on the bottom. There's no form, there's no gate, there's no email secret, there's nothing. You just go there and you can download it, give it a quick look over. I mean, these core team members, they want to build the future. They want to take advantage of the innovation that the platform vendors are offering, right? AI, the cloud, the next generation tooling, and they should. But they won't be able to get there until the operating model gives them their bandwidth back. So I've spent the last 2 years going to user groups and talking to CIOs and such, and I can tell you that it's not a talent problem. The US IT organizations have some super smart people. It's the operating model that's the problem. And it's very much fixable. We can fix it. We have fixed it. Anyways, thank you for your time. Best of luck.